Building an experimentation mindset for strategic progress. You've set the strategic direction and your team have agreed on the OKRs. The quarterly plan looks solid on paper. But 3 months later, you're in the same board meeting explaining why the big initiative hasn't moved the needle. The problem often isn't commitment or capability, it's that your organisation treats strategic execution like a construction project rather than a discovery process. Most growth mandate leaders face this tension. Boards want predictable progress towards ambitious goals, but the path to breakthrough performance is inherently uncertain. You can't predict which growth lever will work, which customer segment will respond, or which operational change will stick. Yet, your organisation defaults to detailed planning, extended analysis, and large-scale rollouts that delay learning for months or even quarters. The companies that grow quickly operate differently. They've built what researchers call an experimentation mindset. That's a systematic approach to running smaller, faster tests that accelerate learning and reduce the cost of being wrong. Instead of betting big on untested assumptions, they create organisational capabilities that allow them to test, learn, and adapt at speed. This capability is particularly critical when you're trying to restart stalled growth. You inherited strategies that stopped working, but you don't know yet which approaches will succeed. Traditional planning cycles are too slow. By the time you learn whether something works, you've burned through runway and board patience. Today we're hearing from 3 researchers whose frameworks complement each other. Rita McGrath from Columbia Business School, whose discovery-driven planning approach provides the strategic foundation. Stefan Tomku from Harvard Business School, whose experimentation research offers the operational discipline. And again, Amy Edmondson, also from Harvard, whose psychological safety work explains why experimentation cultures succeed or fail. Before we begin, a quick note on format. What you're about to hear are synthesised perspectives from these researchers, read by me, Colette Easton of Zockery. These are summaries of their published work and research findings, not original interviews. McGrath's research over 3 decades fundamentally challenges how organisations should approach strategic initiative in uncertain environments. Her core argument, detailed most comprehensively in Seeing Around Corners and The End of Competitive Advantage, centres on replacing assumption-based planning with discovery-driven approaches. According to McGrath, traditional strategic planning operates on a dangerous premise that we can only know in advance what will work. Organisations create detailed business cases, commit significant resource, and measure success by adherence to the original plan. This made sense in stable industries with long periods of competitive advantage, but McGrath's research shows that competitive advantage now only averages 2 to 3 years for most companies. The planning approach that worked for decades now locks organisations into strategies that become obsolete before implementation is complete. McGrath advocates for what she calls discovery-driven planning, a methodology that treats strategic initiatives as experiments designed to surface and test critical assumption. Rather than asking how do we execute this plan, discovery-driven planning asks what would have to be true for this strategy to succeed, and then systematically test those assumptions with minimal resource commitment. This framework begins by documenting all assumptions underlying a strategic initiative, assumptions about customer behaviour, competitive response, operational capability, market timing, and resource requirements. McGrath's research shows that most failed strategies do not fail because of poor execution. They fail because of core assumptions that proved wrong, but organisations only discovered this after major resource commitment. Discovery-driven planning then sequences these assumptions by criticality and uncertainty. Which assumptions, if wrong, would kill the strategy? Which assumptions can we test quickly and cheaply? This creates a learning roadmap that focuses experimentation on the highest risk unknowns first before committing to full-scale execution. McGrath emphasises that this approach requires different success metrics than traditional planning. Instead of measuring adherence to plan, organisations should measure learning velocity, how quickly they surface and resolve critical uncertainty. A failed experiment that reveals a flawed assumption early is more valuable than a successful rollout of an untested strategy that fails slowly at scale. Her research on transient advantage suggests that organisations should allocate resources not just to executing current strategy, but to maintaining a portfolio of strategic experiments. Companies that sustain growth treat strategy not as a fixed plan, but as a dynamic portfolio shifting resource from experiments that aren't working to those that show promise. McGrath's work on inflection points, those moments when competitive assumptions fundamentally shift, highlight why experimentation capability matters for growth mandate CEOs specifically. When previous strategies stop working, it usually signals an inflection point. The question isn't how do we execute better, but what new assumptions should we test? Organisations without experimentation capability respond to inflection points too slowly, defaulting to variations of what worked previously rather than discovering what will work next. The practical implication: strategic initiatives should launch with a minimum viable scale, defined learning milestones, and explicit criteria for scale, pivot, or killing the effort. McGrath's research shows that successful organisations make these go-no-go decisions quarterly or even monthly, not annually. This requires different governance. Boards and executives must judge initiatives by learning progress, not just outcome achievement. McGrath argues that building this capability requires changing how organisations think about failure. In traditional planning, failure to meet targets is considered poor performance. In discovery-driven approach, failure to learn represents poor performance. The shift sounds subtle, but changes everything about how teams operate and what leadership should reinforce. McGrath gives us a strategic foundation. Treat every major milestone initiative as a set of assumptions to test, not a plan to execute. This shifts how you allocate resource, measure progress, and make go, no-go decisions. And this maps directly to your situation. The strategies that worked before hit an inflection point. You need to discover what works now, but you can't afford to bet everything on untested assumptions. Discovery-driven planning provides the discipline to learn fast with less risk. The key tension McGrath surfaces: your board wants predictable progress, but a breakthrough requires embracing uncertainty. The solution isn't choosing between planning and experimentation, it's planning for experimentation. Now for Stefan Tomke's perspectives. Tomke's research, particularly in experimentation works, provides the operational framework for organisations that want to compete on learning speed. While McGrath addresses the strategic mindset, Tomke focuses on the systems, processes, and technologies that enable high-velocity experimentation. Tomke's core argument: experimentation capability has become a source of competitive advantage because digital technologies have dramatically reduced the cost and time required to test these ideas. Organisations that build disciplined experimentation systems can now run hundreds or even thousands of tests annually, while competitors stuck in traditional development cycles can run perhaps a handful. According to Tomke's research, effective experimentation systems require 7 elements working in concert. First, testable hypotheses that specify what you believe will happen and why. Vague objectives like improved customer satisfaction don't work here. Specific hypotheses like adding customer success check-ins at day 30 will reduce churn in month 2 by X%. It will enable learning. Second, rapid iteration cycles that minimise time from hypothesis to result. Tomke's studies of Amazon, Booking.com, and Microsoft show that these companies run complete test cycles, from idea to implementation to analysis, in days or weeks, not months. This velocity compounds. Running 10 small experiments provides more learning than one large initiative, even if several experiments fail. Third, a rigorous experimental design that isolates variables and enables causal inference. Tomke emphasises that most organisations conflate correlation with causation, implementing changes and attributing outcomes to those changes without proper control. His research shows that properly designed A/B testing and controlled experiments provide the only reliable way to understand what actually drives results versus what merely correlates with them. Fourth, an automated testing infrastructure that reduces the cost of experimentation to near zero. Tomke's case studies demonstrate that companies with sophisticated testing platforms can run concurrent experiments continuously. Without automation, each experiment requires significant manual effort, limiting experimentation to occasional big bets. Fifth, integrated analytics that provide fast feedback. Tomke's research shows that experimental values degrade rapidly. Learning from a test completed last quarter has a fraction of the impact of learning from one completed last week. Organizations need real-time or near real-time data pipelines that surface results whilst experiments are still running. Sixth, clear decision protocols that specify who decides what based on the experimental results. Tomke found that many organizations run experiments but then don't act on the findings because the decision rights remain unclear. Effective experimentation requires pre-commitment to what evidence would trigger what action. 7, an organizational culture that treats failed experiments as valuable learning rather than performance failure. Tomke's research consistently shows that organizations that celebrate rigorous experiment with null or negative results generate more innovation than those that only celebrate positive results. The reason? Teams in risk-averse cultures stop testing controversial ideas, which often contain the most breakthrough potential. Tomke emphasizes that these elements must work as a system. Organizations that implement A/B testing tools without changing culture will get limited value. Similarly, organizations that embrace experimentation philosophically but lack the technical infrastructure cannot achieve the velocity required for competitive advantage. His research on enlightened experimentation distinguishes between mere testing and strategic experimentation. Testing asks which option is better. Strategic experimentation asks what can we learn that changes our understanding. The former optimizes existing approaches, the latter discovers new possibilities. For product development specifically, Tomke advocates for fail early, fail often, fail cheap through simulation, prototyping, and pilot testing. His studies show that organizations that front-load experimentation, testing as many options as early when changes cost so little, dramatically outperform those that delay testing until late in development when the changes are expensive. Tomke's work on the tyranny of success highlights this critical trap for growth mandate CEOs. Organizations that previously succeeded often have cultures that will punish failure and reward replicating past success. This creates a pressure to execute proven playbooks rather than discover new ones. When these playbooks stop working, as they have for most growth mandate situations, the cultural antibodies against experimentation become the primary barrier to recovery. The practical implication? Building experimentation capability requires explicit investment in platforms, processes, and culture change. This isn't about adding experimentation to existing work. It's about redesigning how teams develop and launch initiatives. Tomke's research suggests that allocating 10 to 20% of initiative budgets specifically to testing before full-scale rollout. Tomke gives us the operational blueprint, 7 interconnected elements that enable high-velocity learning. The key insight? Experimentation capability isn't just cultural change or just technology investment, it is a system that combines both. The critical piece for companies at your scale: you don't need Amazon-level sophistication to benefit from this approach. The trap Tomke identifies is particularly relevant to your situation. Success patterns from previous growth phases create antibodies against experimentation. Your organization defaults to executing what worked before, even though market conditions have shifted. Breaking this requires explicit cultural and operational intervention. Time again for some of Amy Edmondson's perspective. Edmondson's research over 25 years, culminating in the Fearless Organisation and Right Kind of Wrong, explains why experimentation capability depends fundamentally on psychological safety, the belief that one can speak up, ask questions, admit mistakes, and propose ideas without fear of punishment or humiliation. According to Edmondson's studies across industries, teams with high psychological safety run more experiments, learn faster, and adapt more effectively than teams where people fear looking incompetent. This isn't because high safety teams are less rigorous or demanding. Edmondson's research shows the opposite. Psychological safety enables productive disagreement, challenge of assumptions, and honest assessments of results. Edmondson distinguishes between 3 types of failure, each requiring different organisational response. First, preventable failures, mistakes that shouldn't happen, like medication errors or safety violations. These warrant investigation and process improvement, not punishment, but they're not experiments gone wrong. Second, unavoidable failures, bad outcomes despite proper execution, often from complexity or randomness. These require resilience and quick recovery, but offer limited learning value. Third, intelligent failures, outcomes from well-designed tests in uncertain domains. Edmondson's research shows that these are the only failures that organisations should celebrate because they provide unique learning. Yet most organisations treat all failures similarly, creating culture where people avoid any action that might not succeed. For experimentation to flourish, Edmondson argues that leaders must actively differentiate these failure types and respond accordingly. This means asking different questions. Did we design a good test rather than did the test succeed? And what did we learn rather than why didn't this work? Edmondson's framework for building psychological safety focuses on 3 categories of leader behaviour. First, frame the work accurately, explicitly stating that the challenges faced involve uncertainty and interdependence and require experimentation. When leaders frame all work as execution of known processes, teams naturally avoid experiments that may fail. Second, invite participation, actively ask for input, admitting knowledge gaps and model curiosity about different perspectives. Edmondson's studies show that teams mirror leader behaviour. Leaders who present certainty produce teams that hide doubt. Leaders who express thoughtful uncertainty produce teams that surface and test assumption. Third, responding productively, thanking people who surface problems, speaking up with concerns, or sharing experimentation results that didn't match the hypothesis. Edmondson's research demonstrates that a single dismissive or punitive response can suppress speaking up for months. Conversely, leaders who consistently respond to unwelcome news with curiosity create culture where the information flows freely. Edmondson emphasises that psychological safety doesn't mean lowering standards or avoiding accountability. Her research shows that high-performing teams combine psychological safety with high accountability. This is what she calls the learning zone. Low safety with high accountability creates anxiety zones where people hide problems. High safety with low accountability creates comfort zones where people don't push themselves. Only the combination of both dimensions enables the productive discomfort required for experimentation. For experimentation specifically, Edmondson's work identifies 3 psychological safety traps that organisations often fall into. First, the brilliant jerk trap, tolerating people who produce results but undermine team safety. These individuals signal that competence matters more than collaboration, shutting down the very experimentation that drives breakthrough. Second, the looking good trap, where leaders inadvertently punish candour by responding defensively to challenges or bad news. Edmondson's studies show that even well-intentioned leaders often react to experiment failures with a disappointment that feels like criticism, training teams to hide or spin those negative results. Third, the execution bias trap, where organisations claim to value learning but reward and promote based solely on hitting targets. This creates a pressure to commit to outcomes before testing assumptions, the opposite of an experimental mindset. Edmondson's recent work on teaming, forming and reforming teams rapidly to tackle new challenges highlights why experimentation capability matters increasingly. When competitive advantage shifts quickly, organisations need teams that can test new approaches without lengthy trust building or fear of interpersonal risk. Psychological safety enables this speed. So for you specifically, a CEO with a growth mandate, Edmondson's research suggests a critical dynamic. Organisations that grow successfully often develop cultures that are optimised for execution, not experimentation. Success is reinforced following proven playbooks and meeting commitments. These cultural patterns now impede the very discovery required to restart growth. The practical implication: building experimentation capability requires explicit attention to team dynamics, not just process redesign. This means regular team discussions about failure types, leader modelling of curiosity over certainty, and reward systems that recognise learning progress alongside outcome achievement. Edmondson's research on implementation suggests starting with small teams and specific projects where psychologically safe and experimentation can succeed visibly. These successes will then provide proof points that enable cultural change at a larger scale. Attempting to shift entire organisational cultures simultaneously rarely works. Targeted interventions that demonstrate value create pull for broader adoption. These three frameworks come together to form a coherent approach to building experimentation capability, a service we offer at Zockery because it's a driver and an optimizer of OKR progress. McGrath provides the strategic discipline: treat major initiatives as portfolios of assumptions to test sequentially, not plans to execute linearly. This changes resource allocation, success metrics, and governance conversations. Tomke provides the operational system, those 7 elements that enable high-velocity testing, from hypothesis formulation through to automated infrastructure and decision protocols. This changes how teams develop and launch initiatives. Edmondson provides the cultural foundation, psychological safety that enables teams to surface uncertainty, run intelligent failures, and learn from results without fear. This changes leadership behaviour and team dynamics. The pattern across all 3? Experimentation capability isn't about reducing rigour or accepting lower standards. It's about redirecting organisational energy from defending assumptions to testing them, from executing untested plans to discovering what works. For your situation, this capability is particularly critical. You don't have the luxury of long planning cycles or large-scale rollouts that might fail. You need to test multiple growth hypotheses quickly, learn what works, and double down before running out of runway or board patience. The practical approach these researchers suggest: start with one strategic initiative this quarter. Document the core assumptions. What must be true for this to succeed? Sequence those assumptions by risk and testability. Design minimal viable tests for the highest risk assumptions first. Create clear learning milestones and a go, no-go criteria. Get your leadership team aligned on treating this as discovery, not execution. The teams that work in this way will, in weeks, what traditional approaches have taken quarters to discover. That velocity compounds, that each learning cycle improves the next hypothesis, and that teams get faster at designing and running tests. The question to reflect on: which strategic initiative are you betting on right now without having tested the core assumptions? What would it take to run a 4-week experiment instead of a 6-month rollout?